So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this seminar on why work needs to shape up. I'm Michael Whitmore. I'm a research leader at RAND Europe, and we're pleased to be hosting this event. RAND Europe, as a research organisation, covers many policy and organisational decision-making areas across from health, across the social policy, defence, and so on. And we're very pleased to be part of this year's Cambridge Festival, run by the University of Cambridge. My background is over 30 years in the health and social care space. I've just come back off from a stint of designing the COVID-19 vaccination programme. And most recently, over the last 5 years, I've been very pleased to be working with and for RAND Europe on various aspects of health and work, including interesting aspects around evidence of health and work. However, my role today is to ensure that we get the best out of our hour that we have. So as I mentioned, Cambridge Festival, run by the University of Cambridge, is this year bringing together the festival ideas and the science festival together. So we're very pleased to be running this. And I'm just going to explain to you a little bit about how to work around the webinar. So as you'll see in that screen there, at the moment, our attendee audio and video are disabled, so you shouldn't be able to be seen or be able to speak at the moment. The session is being recorded and it will be posted up via the Cambridge University YouTube at a later date. So this is to advise you if you don't wish to be recorded to make yourself absent at that point. Post questions using the Q&A function at any time. So I would remind you that as the panelists speak, you're able to post in the Q&A function. So please use the Q&A function, and near the end, I'll pick up any questions that we've got coming in. There is closed captioning. You'll see that probably at the bottom of your screens. If you don't want to see that subtitling, that closed captioning, then just click onto the live transcript tab on your screen. You should be able to navigate to switch that off. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We have Professor Chris Warhurst. He's Director of the Institute for Employment Research at the University of Warwick in the UK. He's an internationally recognised expert on job quality and skills, and to use science to help improve working life. He's published 17 books, and I'm sure that's counting, the latest being Aesthetic Labour, and is co-editing the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Job Quality. He's currently working on the Horizon 2020 funded research project examining the future of work and welfare in the digital age. His roles as expert advisor include to the UK, Scottish and Australian governments, as well as to Eurofund, the OECD, Oxfam Scotland, and the Scottish Living Wage Campaign. And also over 2017 and 18, he was a member of the Carnegie Trust and the RSA Short Life Expert Group on Job Quality, constituted to respond to the recommendations on improving job quality, which was set out in the UK government's Taylor Review of Modern Working Practices. Also joining Chris as well, we've got Dr. Christian van Stolk. Chris is Executive Vice President of RAND Europe, and he has worked extensively on the health and wellbeing in the workplace, and his research in the past has focused on improving the health and wellbeing of staff in the National Health Service in the UK, for instance, maintaining and gaining employment for those with common mental health conditions, and looking at the relationship between productivity and health and wellbeing outcomes. Over the years, he's advised large private sector employers, the UK government, European institutions, the OECD, and the World Bank. He currently manages RAND Europe's work on Britain's Healthiest Workplace competition, as well as partnership with Vitality Health and Asia's Healthiest Workplace competitions with AIA. And he sits on several expert panels for the UK government, including those on occupational health, mental health, and employee health and wellbeing in the NHS. So very pleased to have them join us this afternoon. And I'll just explain now a little bit about how the event will work out. And so first, we're intending to hear first from Professor Chris Warhurst. He'll be exploring some of the current issues facing us in the workplace. He'll be outlining what we already know about the outline of job design and its association with well-being. And then secondly, Dr. Chris Van Stoke will pick up on how the COVID pandemic has shaped the work environment, how some may have benefited from working from their homes, whilst others have felt the pressure of that, and also, of course, spanning across key workers, people in warehouse logistics, and many of those that also remain in furlough. So there's plenty of different pressures and forces at play around the COVID pandemic, and as that changes, especially on today, as our stay-at-home direction in England itself has changed. Thirdly, we'll open up the panel to a Q&A from the wider participant audience. So if you've got any questions from the audience, so please do send, as I mentioned, any questions in the QA box. And so I think without further ado, I'm going to now hand it over to Chris Warhurst, who will take us through his presentation first.
Mike, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing. I'm just pulling up my screen at the moment. Mike, can you just confirm that that's on your screen?
It's on the screen. I'm not in presentation mode just yet.
Okay.
It is now.
Okay. So Mike, again, thank you for chairing, and everybody, thank you for coming along to this session. The talk really emerges out of some of the efforts Chris and myself have been expending recently on initiatives to try and create healthy jobs. And this, we think should be a public policy issue, both generally and, as we'll see when Chris picks up the conversation in a few minutes, certainly around what's been happening with the COVID pandemic. We think this should be a public health issue, primarily because the quality of jobs matter. We spend on average about 40 hours a week at work. That's if we're full-time, about 20 hours a week if we're part-time. So it consumes a lot of hours of our lives. But not only that, it's also the place where our health and safety becomes very important. Not just our health and safety in the work, but the kind of health and safety, or psychological and physical health that we get from work. And indeed, one of our colleagues, Maria Albin, who's in Sweden, who's a health and safety expert, would argue that occupational health and safety is in fact the cornerstone of job quality in whatever country, in whatever job we're in. Now, we would argue that it should be, once again, a very salient public policy issue, but of course, the health of jobs, or healthy jobs, have been a focus of public policy since the Industrial Revolution started. The Factory Acts were introduced over the 1830s and 1840s to try and protect children and women from long working hours and the impact that it was having on them. Very good book written last year by Helen McCarthy on the history of working motherhood shows how over the course of the First World War, there was a big debate about women not working because they wanted to protect the health of women in general, and they wanted to reduce infant mortality. And this kind of, Helen McCarthy argues in this book, that kind of position was supported even by ardent feminists and suffragettes at the time, because this was about protecting women and children. And then for those of you who have not come across this case, I'd urge you to read the book. It's a book called The Headscarf Revolutionaries, which was written by Lavery in 2015, and it's about the triple trawler disaster that happened to Hull in England in 1968, where 58 men lost their lives. And it's how Lillian Bilocca from Hull campaigned for safety equipment on deep sea trawlers to try and prevent future lives being lost at sea. So there's been a whole, and she was very successful with that. She campaigned and lobbied the government at the time to introduce health and safety health and safety initiatives on trawlers. So there's been a lot of focus on public policy, within public policy and health over the years. But we would argue, Chris and myself, that this is an unresolved issue, and there's unfinished business from the 2008 Black Report, led by Dame Carol Black, where she probably more famously, the report is more famously known for the emergence of the fit for work notes. But actually, there's a whole section in there about how we need to rethink the links between occupational health and safety and occupational health as a profession and other bits of work, people like myself who are, work with economists and sociologists and psychologists at work. And at that time that Carol was writing, it was calculated that around about a fifth of UK workers were suffering from some form of ill health in that time. And we can see now, latest figures or latest available figures from the Health and Safety Executive, about 1.6 million workers suffer from ill health. And the costs of that are calculated within a kind of wide envelope between 14.5 to just over 18 billion pounds a year. But what's interesting within that figure is it only reports new cases in any given year, and some diseases such as cancer are omitted. The costs of cancer are omitted from those calculations. So, as Carol was saying back, Dame Carol Black in 2008, the actual cost could be high as 60 billion pounds per annum, and that's an awful lot of public spend on ill health caused by jobs. And Chris and myself are very concerned that we should try and do something about this. When we're reflecting on current policy and research in this field, three things strike us. One is that currently we need to recognize that physical and psychosocial ill health from jobs matter, but that currently there's a really heavy focus on psychosocial health. Mental health, the OECD has flagged, should be a priority of all governments in its member states. And we think one of the reasons for this is the kind of very influential work of Karasak and Thurl in the early 1990s, which they wrote a book called Healthy Work. And in it, they were arguing that work should be improved because it was damaging on the psychosocial health of workers. But they were arguing that job stress is not inevitable. We can design jobs in particular ways to alleviate stress. I think that focus on stress is important, particularly as other research following the global financial crisis of 2007-2008 shows that job-related stress increases after an economic recession. And it's also worth noting, I think, that we're often very familiar with the stresses that not having a job causes. And Maria Yehoda's work is very famous in that respect. I always think about F. Scott Fitzgerald writing about his own life, that when his father lost his job, it completely changed his father's life. He just didn't recognize his father after that. His father was a different person. We're very familiar with the psychosocial impacts of losing a job. But actually, there's some research done from Australia by Butterworth and his colleagues, which shows that psychological ill health is worse for those people in a poor job than no job. And that's startling. So the focus on psychosocial health and mental health is important, but we'd argue it's not sufficient. We also need to think more about the physical risks because they haven't disappeared. And I think in one sense, there's been a kind of pullback from policymakers and researchers from physical health, in part because it looks like we've solved it. And fatalities from work have flatlined, and they're pretty rare events, the Health and Safety Executive says, and reports of ill health, not deaths, have also flatlined over 10 years. So it looks like we've kind of solved it. We've got regulations in place. But it's interesting that even when we look at measures of job quality, data sets of job quality, there's lots of questions around psychosocial health and mental health problems in general, but there's very little on physical health and the risks to physical health from jobs. Now, given the point that Maria Albing would make that occupational health and safety is a vital part of job quality, that seems to be bizarre. So it's something we, in a sense, we kind of, Bastille and his colleagues would argue that when we're thinking about job quality, we tend to overlook this now because we think we've kind of solved it. But in actual fact, there are still lots of problems that persist with physical health. You know, bad backs amongst hotel room cleaners. And a lot of that goes unreported because, you know, room cleaners are not protected. The unionization isn't great in those industries, and they fear losing their jobs. There's an element of fatalism among some of that. This is just what happens in these kind of jobs. And of course, they've got no voice to try and change that. So we think it's very important that we have an appropriate balance between physical and psychosocial health in the workplace. The second thing that strikes us is that in the present situation, solutions to health and well-being problems at work tend to be remedial, in the sense that interventions tend to deal with the symptoms rather than the causes of ill health. I've been slightly glib here when I talk about mindfulness, but it's not unusual when I've talked to people in boardrooms that at boardroom level, when they talk about healthy lifestyles at work, they stick a bowl of fruit on the boardroom table and think they've solved everything. Or alternatively, people turn up at their GPs with either physical or mental health problems related to the work. It could be stress, it could be aches and pains. And what happens typically is that GPs prescribe drugs as a way of trying to solve this rather than going to the root cause. And GPs themselves are not really trained in occupational health unless they want to do it as an option at medical school. The occupational health profession itself realizes this problem, but sees itself really wanting to get in slightly earlier with preventions. But again, it's not really dealing with the sources of the problems. It's just trying to pick up those problems a bit earlier and try to deal with them. And we know that there's a kind of shift in the ground here on this, that people recognize that perhaps what we need is not a reactive approach, not a remedial approach, but a proactive approach, a strategic approach, which tries to stop these things from happening in the first place. And one of the key reports which has flagged this was the Taylor Review of Modern Working Practices, which came out in 2017, which was arguing that we should have a more proactive approach to workplace health. In other words, as one of the GPs a number of years said to me a few years ago, what we need are better jobs, not more drugs. So we need to shift, we think, some of those problems. And the third issue really is we need to recognize that ill health occurs from both work and employment. Now, we use the term work as a kind of shorthand for jobs, but actually jobs comprise both work and employment. By work, we mean the kind of set of activities we do. And by employment, we mean once those activities become paid, there's a set of terms and conditions around them, like how much you get paid, how much training you get, how many hours you work, what type of contract you've got. And in this respect, it's notable, as I say, with Karasek and Thurl's work earlier, that when they were prescribing healthy work, they were focusing on the working environment. What they said is we should restructure the work. And they were heavily influenced by the quality of work in life movement in the 1950s and 1960s, which was very, very prominent in Britain and worldwide as a movement around this. But it itself, although it made some noises about wanting to improve terms and conditions of employment, actually again focused on the workplace and things like introducing team working and job rotation. Didn't really, as I say, focus much on employment. But employment types and employment patterns matter. We know that non-standard employment, with standard employment being the 9 to 5, Monday to Friday type of work. With non-standard employment, there's higher mental health problems, and interestingly, and perhaps worryingly, there's higher rates of mortality amongst those workers who've got non-standard employment. We know that shift work as well, particularly night shifts, are linked to higher mental health problems and linked to higher rates of cancer risks amongst those workers who do them. So really, we need to be thinking about work and employment when we're thinking about ill health from jobs. And as we say, we think the kind of tide's turning on this, and it's coming back. In the Department for Health put out a report in 2017 which says good work supports good health, in which good work has now become a shorthand of the UK government for both encompassing work and employment. In other words, good work is what we might call good job quality. And this approach has been recently championed by Marmot in his review of 10 years on, that he thinks we ought to start to go back looking at not just the outcomes of ill health at work, but looking at the causes of that and trying to think about the composition of jobs, because jobs themselves can be healthy and they can be ill healthy. And I think we've seen potentially the impact of physical and mental health on workers through their jobs becoming really acutely salient with the COVID crisis. I think this is where I'll hand over to Chris.
Well, thank you, Chris. That is a really quite powerful introduction. And I guess I just wanted to reflect on what's been happening in the current pandemic. And it's pretty obvious that all of our working routines have changed quite substantially, not least the fact that I'm talking to you today like this and not in an auditorium at the university. And some of those aspects that have changed are pretty obvious. We're working from home, as I'm doing currently. Workplaces are incorporating COVID secure measures. And many of us have additional caring responsibilities. A proportion of us have been furloughed, and many of us are facing job insecurity. And I guess within all of this, the question I'm going to ask is, well, what is the starting point to some extent? What was happening before we entered this pandemic? And I guess the message that I have is perhaps not the most positive message, but I will end on a positive note, that perhaps we were not in as good a shape at the start of this crisis as we perhaps thought we were. And I'm going to share a few slides that will illustrate this. Bear with me. I hope that's... Can you see these slides, Mike?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, here's a few slides that I always like to present, and they give you an idea on productivity loss associated with suboptimal health and well-being. And this is data that we collect as part of Britain's Healthiest Workplace, which is a large survey of UK employers and their employees. And this number shows you over the years what we're finding in terms of productivity loss due to suboptimal health. And as you can see, over time, the number of days lost due to poor suboptimal health, as captured in this survey, is increasing up to 2019, of course, at the start of the pandemic. And so what you see in 2019 is that about 14.6% of working days are being lost due to poor health and well-being. And that's about 35 days per worker per year in terms of the employers that we survey. Now, you might ask, well, what do we capture in terms of this suboptimal health? Well, it consists of two components. The first component is pretty obvious. That is absenteeism, when people are away from their desks due to poor health and well-being. The second is presenteeism, which is a much more difficult concept to capture. Namely, this is when people are often in the workplace, but are suffering from poor health and well-being, which is affecting their productivity. And if you add these two together, you get to that annual productivity loss number, or the working days lost that I just gave you in terms of this 14.6%. It's also important to note, and this is where some of Chris' earlier comments come into play, is that the vast majority of productivity loss that we capture is captured by, or it consists of that, of presenteeism. And I will explain a little bit more about what might be driving this productivity loss number, and in particular, presenteeism. So in terms of the drivers of productivity over time, so what is causing this productivity loss over time? Well, there are some real important constituent drivers. So poor musculoskeletal health is certainly a factor within all of this. Mental health is a very significant driver, and I would argue that between those two, we are probably capturing the largest factors in terms of contributing to productivity loss over time. Poor sleep is another factor. Poor financial well-being, and this gets into some of those remarks that Chris made about job insecurity around employment issues, for instance. And also a wide variety of job design factors as well, as people having lack of control in the workplace, for instance, is an issue. Poor relationships at work, and also lack of clarity around the role in the workplace. So all of these factors are drivers of productivity over time. And of course, not surprisingly, when we start looking at some of those factors, we also see perhaps some worrying pictures. Now, here is, again, a stat that we collect of employees who participate in the surveys that we do as, in Britain's Healthiest Workplace. And again, if we look across the same scale at employees basically responding to the survey, and according to the scale that we use in the survey for being at risk for mental health, we see a huge increase from 2015 to 2019 in terms of employees reporting being at risk for poor mental health, in this case, being clinically depressed according to the scale. So we see this doubling, and whatever statistic you would use in the data that we collect across the piece, it would indicate that we are currently facing a mental health epidemic in the workplace. Another factor that I mentioned is around musculoskeletal disorders and musculoskeletal conditions. Here you don't see an increase, but you really see a steady state of about 80% of employees reporting having at least one MSK condition. And now keep in mind that MSK and mental health are the biggest contributors to that productivity loss number that I showed you earlier. So together, these are very significant factors that are driving that productivity loss number, not exclusively, but they're contributing to this substantially. So what has changed in the pandemic? Well, what the pandemic has showed is that many of the indicators are getting worse over time. And so I've shown here a few numbers from different surveys in terms of the number of people who are experiencing depression, for instance, the number of adults developing moderate to severe depressive symptoms, for instance, and the CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development survey that shows that about 43% of employees say their general mental health has worsened since the outbreak. So if you're looking at just a mental health picture, these are some worrying signs, for instance. Financial security, 40% said their financial security has decreased since the start of the crisis. This is perhaps not surprising and something we see in other crises as well. Again, data from the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development. And over 40% of those surveyed perceive it also harder to fall asleep, for instance. And more people, interesting enough, according to survey work of the Institute of Employment Studies, are complaining of musculoskeletal conditions compared to before the pandemic. And of course, there's comorbidity here as well in terms of mental health issues. So many of these indicators are getting worse during the pandemic. And of course, it stands to reason that that also will have an adverse impact in terms of that productivity loss number. But it's not only these indicators. What we know, and Chris alluded to this as well, is that certain groups are affected more than other groups. And regardless of sectors, what we're seeing is that minorities, the disabled, the young, those shielding, are most at risk in many of these in these categories in terms of worsening mental health, poor sleep, and so on, and also have less job security in many ways. And of course, we also know that there are some great examples from certain sectors where there are, particular challenges. A whole host of work about post-traumatic stress disorder in the NHS, and especially those working in intensive care units, for instance. Certain sectors that have been disproportionately affected by this crisis, such as retail and hospitality. So there are particular challenges in those groups as well. So it's important to say that, given all these indicators, that it stands to reason that also our productivity loss is likely to get worse over time. And so this presents quite a significant challenge to us. So, sorry about that. There was a particular challenge to us, where there's to us as a society. And our argument, and I guess Chris and I agree on this, is that there is really shared value between individual, society, and employees in finding better answers to this. And I guess the key question that we're asking is how workplaces and job design can facilitate better health. And I think this is of the utmost importance in this current situation, because in previous crises, what we've seen is that we haven't met this challenge. And that rather than asking the questions about what constitutes better work, the discussion became around any work. So, and certainly some of the challenges we see today perhaps also have their origin in the crisis of 2009. But perhaps, Mike, here I'll stop and hand back to you.
Thanks very much, both the Chris's there for the great tour back from the 1800s right through to present day COVID times of health and work and keeping the staff healthy or not, as the case may be. I think some very interesting themes pulled out there, both from the psychosocial health, the way we've moved in and out of those aspects. Mental health, Chris, you mentioned about financial health as well, and MSK and so on. So an awful lot of interesting aspects. And I think to help summarize that, maybe if I ask a couple of questions here, and then maybe both of you could come back around the areas. So firstly, I think it'd be interesting to know what needs to change to bridge the gap between these health and wellbeing job design issues. So what can be done? What needs to change to actually help to bridge that gap? And then I think secondly is, what concrete examples could you give, for instance, to how it works? With that, maybe if we move over now to Professor Chris Warhurst. Chris, maybe you could take the floor first and maybe respond to that.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. I think in terms of what needs to change, I think the first thing we need to do is, as Chris and myself flagged, we need to put jobs back on the agenda as a public policy issue. I mean, when we think about jobs, within my lifetime, jobs were a source of industrial conflict. Jobs are currently a source of poor productivity. Now, all those things have got some traction on them, but we don't tend to think first and foremost of jobs as a public policy issue. That jobs have a real impact on health and a real cost on the NHS. And I think we should be doing that both in general and I think because post this current pandemic, there's going to be a real squeeze on the NHS finances. And so if we can be in a situation where we're creating healthy jobs, that will minimize the burden on the health service. So I think first and foremost, key thing is for us to think about jobs as a public policy issue.
Thanks, Chris. Chris, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think there's also some practical aspects, Mike. And I think part of the challenge that we have in terms of thinking about occupational health is, I guess by its nature, it's a multidisciplinary issue. And I think that's also its fundamental problem, in a sense. It sits across disciplines. It is perhaps not as valued as it could be. At times, perhaps it doesn't attract, and apologies to any occupational physicians in the room, but it perhaps doesn't always attract the best and the brightest. And it's not necessarily taught as a discipline in medical schools, engineering departments, or business schools. So in some ways, around these occupational health issues, we put that sort of as a second order or a third order issue. And it also comes down to how we manage, I guess, our human capital and how we prioritize this. And I guess my argument always is when I take these things into a boardroom setting is that we would not accept or tolerate our IT systems to be run in the same way that we run our human capital. So it's kind of an interesting observation in the sense is that we seem to be placing more value in sort of some of those issues rather than just managing human capital in general.
Thanks, Chris. And how much do you think, you used that phrase a couple of times there, human capital, how much do you think that actually stands in the way of us looking at human health when we're thinking of staff as resource rather than as human beings?
Well, I hope what you took from the presentation is that the two are interlinked and intertwined. So this is a kind of a shared value proposition. I think employees that have better health and well-being also will be more productive. So in some ways, the business outcomes follow from having better health and well-being in the workplace. So it should be a shared value proposition, but somehow sometimes these things are traded off, which is perhaps also part of the problem.
Great. So whilst we're navigating the technology here, Chris, I should just check to Chris Warhurst if there's anything else you'd like to add following Chris's response there.
Now, Mike, you did ask us if what the practical interventions may be, and what we've set out there is the kind of changes to the framework, the interdisciplinarity, the shift to public policy, but there will be some practical solutions I think we can think about in the workplace. And I mentioned that the term good work, which has been adopted by the UK government, because it covers both employment practices and work practices. And I think there are things that companies can do internally to try and create more healthy jobs. And then, you know, we talk in terms of employment about less precarious employment. One of the things that would be useful to see disappear would be 0 hours contracts. And some governments in Scotland, for example, are moving that way. The public sector shouldn't be offering them, so that might help. But there are less costly things they can do. That, you know, companies can use the human capacities or the human capital that they already possess. We know as a source of frustration, skill underuse amongst employees is huge, and as I say, that creates huge dissatisfaction and stresses for workers. So, if employers could learn to better use the skills amongst their existing workforce, that would be useful. And actually, that strikes at what Chris was saying about the shared value proposition. That's a win-win. It's a win for employees, and it's a win for their employers as well.
It's good to see that we've gained some questions coming through the Q&A. So please do post questions there, and I'll get to start to ask some of these. And I think another thing, Chris, as you were mentioning as well, was around the sense of the idea that better health does not, you know, better work will create better health, but more work of poor work does not necessarily mean a better health as a result of that. And it seems to me that there's still more research to be done around that separation between what good employment is, as around what the good jobs are. Would you say that was true?
Well, if you're asking me, Mike, I mean, one of the things that Chris and myself are very aware of is that there is an awful lot of research around work and employment and the links between ill health and working practices and ill health and employment practices. But two things happen. It's not brought together systematically. And secondly, it seems to us, it's never usefully applied to the occupational health field. I mean, people like myself spend 20 or 30 years researching this, and I've got a huge institute which does all of this. And we barely cross the road to Warwick Medical School to talk to them about it. Now that seems to me incredibly strange, given that, you know, one of the heaviest workload cases for GPs are people who present because of work-related health problems. There's a disconnect there. We'd like to rejoin that. We'd like to make that connection again between the existing research and, in part, bring it all together and get synergies out of it, we think.
And I think another challenge, Chris, is also that I think the way that we learn lessons between businesses and organizations is also suboptimal in some ways. There are many good things that are happening in many organizations, but we do not necessarily share those lessons. And also, I think transferring some of those practices and that learning, particularly to small and medium-sized enterprises, is still a challenge. And of course, the majority of employees in the UK work for small and medium-sized enterprises. So we always talk about the Rolls-Royce examples and Jaguar Land Rover and so on. And those are important. But ultimately, most of us work for small to medium-sized enterprises, and many of those are struggling and of course, trying to survive.
Lovely. So I'm going to now move to some of the questions that are coming in from the floor. And where there are names marked against them, I'll mention who it is that's asked those. And so I'm going to go from the top of the list and go with one here from Mark Howard. So what do you both think about functional job descriptions based around risk and job design factors? So what do you think about those being written into good work planning?
I think it actually be used. I mean, I think in one sense that's done already. That's what health and safety executives do. They look at risk inside workplaces, but it's often done at a general level. And where there are trade unions, it's already then picked up. But I think it would be useful, not necessarily for employers to be doing that, because that would be quite a bureaucratic task. But it would be useful for people like ourselves to be able to give indications to employers about what is more risky than not risky. So, for example, if we could make the research which is known around non-standard employment inducing more mental health or shift work creating more cancer risks, there's an education function there for employers, not necessarily a kind of bureaucratic function. And one of the things Chris and myself are also, what's exercising our minds is how we can change maybe some of the curriculum curricula in the business schools and engineering schools and the medical schools to pull some of these kind of things out, because the next generation of managers ought really to be familiar with that kind of research as part of their management education. So I think there's probably there are probably different ways to come to the same point.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add, Mike, is that clarity around role and responsibilities in and by itself can be useful. And it's surprising how often there is lack of clarity around roles and responsibilities for a given employee. And that can produce quite significant stress. So on a very basic level, I would say be very clear about the role description, about the responsibilities of an individual, because that will help them in terms of their career or their employment.
Great. Well, thanks. Let's move on to the next one then. So, Chris van Stolk, this may be one for you. So in terms of working life, is there anything good that has come from the pandemic?
Well, I think in terms of the good aspect of the pandemic, of course, is the flexibility that many of us have had. And I think it's unrealistic to expect that we will go back to working the way that we were working before the pandemic. And that flexibility will stay with us. And of course, the autonomy that some people have is critically important. For instance, I'll give you a simple stat, is that most people in the National Health Service, for instance, were not aware of their employers' flexible working policies, nor were they using them. So I think that debate has completely broken open in some ways, in the sense that flexible working will be very much standard in many jobs at the moment. So that is a real positive. And I think the other thing I would add is that much of the disruption that we've seen in the pandemic is also due to the fact that we've seen a change in people's working routines. We know that those individuals who already were working from home before the pandemic did relatively well during the pandemic. So they were used to working in that way. And I think it takes humans quite some time to get used to different working patterns. So it also, I think, is normal to assume that these kind of working patterns we will get used to, and as such probably have less of an impact in terms of our health and well-being going forward. So I think there's an adjustment period that we're going through at the moment as well, and then probably an acceleration to some of the technologies that we're using. So it's not doom and gloom, but I do want to emphasize is that the point I made about the mental health epidemic is very, very important. It's something that we shouldn't underestimate in terms of what we're seeing currently in our societies.
Great, thanks, Chris. And so we've got quite a number of questions coming in now. So lots of interesting debate going to be coming across. So I think moving on to the next question there from Eleanor. So she asks, what are some of the examples of how you operationalize presenteeism, in the sense of it seems as if it would be very difficult to measure compared with absenteeism. So how would you get a handle on presenteeism? And again, Chris van Stolk, I don't know whether you would like to lead on that one.
I'll start, and perhaps Chris can come in after me. But there are reasonably good survey tools now to measure presenteeism. So it's not it is very much doable from that point of view. Of course, it's less visible. So I think it's something that you do need to measure and you do need to capture. In a different way, so be it through surveys. But as I mentioned, there are a number of factors that are very closely associated with presenteeism as well, which include mental health and so on. Some of those aspects might be more visible in the workplace, so that this might be something that you can work with line managers on in terms of trying to understand those issues and trying to address those issues. So presenteeism is certainly less visible. But not necessarily impossible to capture if you're using regular surveys anyway. But Chris, I don't know if you want to come in on that.
No, Chris, I think you've said it. I mean, it is an important point how we operationalize presenteeism, but I think there are methods for doing that, and there are also methods we can use for trying to address that, which emerge from those measures. As you mentioned, good line management. I mean, the kind of trust and autonomy are two sides of the same coin, and we do know that one of the most important features of work, job satisfaction for most employees is good line management and support from line management. Now it seems that the lack of support or concerns around the lack of support often feed into one of the causes of presenteeism. So if we can address those kind of things, I think we make a huge step forward.
Absolutely. So another interesting point coming in from Peter Zip. So thanks for this, Peter. So until around 20 years ago, when you walked out of the office in the evening, that was the end of your obligations until you walked back in the next morning. And so I think some of us of a certain age might be able to remember those times. And then so today people are expected to react to emails, texts and phone calls at any time of the day or night. And he also mentions that probably generally not paid any more for it. So what are the effects of this always on work culture? And I'll open that floor to either Chris or Chris for that. I don't know who'd like to take this one first.
Well, it's certainly true that if you looked even 10, 15 years ago, blue collar workers or workers in routine jobs, when they, as Pete Zip is saying, when they left work, that was the end of it until the next morning. For some white collar workers, that was also the case. I mean, if you worked in a bank, you couldn't take your money home with you, that you had in your till. So pretty much when you worked in a bank at 5 o'clock, you left and you went home till 9 o'clock the next day. That was not always the case, though, for some workers. I mean, managers, professionals, we know that they had the longest working hours anyway, even before the new technologies. But it's certainly the case now that there are two things happening, I think. One is the invasion of the internet into people's lives, which keeps them, as Pete's saying, on anytime, anywhere, and then not being paid for that. But there's kind of two issues there, aren't there? One is not work-life balance, but work-life boundaries. And it's clear that some people like very clear boundaries, and we've seen that during the COVID pandemic as well. I was talking to somebody in the trade union movement the other week who said that he puts a curtain up during the day when he's working and takes the curtain down at night when he comes off Zoom to open the space up again. So you can clear boundaries between work and non-work and working life. But then there's the other issue about if you're permanently on call, are you being paid for it, and should you be expected to engage with that? And I think that's where we're now. One of the things which will come out of working from home with COVID is we will need to have a rethink around the issue of flexibility, because we've got hybridity and agile working, which has been able to work in different places, but the flexibility part, being on call all the time, that I think we will need to rethink if we are to make working from home a healthy experience.
I think you're right, Chris. And I think also we shouldn't underestimate the disruption of these new technologies and the impact they've had on job security, for instance. So it's not just the always on culture, but it's also that many workers now have less security than before. And I think that combination can be quite tricky. And it's interesting, just along those lines, is that when you look at, for instance, the stress in the public sector, amongst public sector workers, has also gradually increased over time, perhaps also reflecting on these kind of new ways of working. So very few sectors have been immune to that over time.
Yeah, and I know anecdotally as well through clients that I work with, there's that sense of boundaries between the home and the office that has been taken away from us over the last year. It's been difficult for some people to manage and provided opportunities for others. So I agree with that. And actually, I think I'll pick up on this anonymous question as well that came in at the same time. So conversely, do you think that jobs being done virtually or from home will be better for productivity and worker health?
Well, it's funny. A nice report came out from Alan Felstead, who's a colleague at Cardiff University the week, talking about productivity and working from home, and how there's a perception, which seems to be borne out in the statistics, that productivity has gone up. But one of the things which worried me when I dug down a bit further into the report is 30% of those people who report productivity going up also cite the fact that they've lost their commute time, and they're effectively working during their commute, what would have been their commute time. So potentially what they're doing is extending their working day. Now that's slightly more problematic, I think. On the other hand, we talk about productivity gains because we're not being interrupted by people. That's certainly true because we're working at home by ourselves. But on the other hand, I also worry about whether or not some of the informal social interactions in the workplace that we have, those, the kind of water cooler conversations, we lose those. And in doing so, we lose some of the social glue and culture which keeps us together. And we lose some of the exchange of information, which helps with the small incremental innovations that we've got in workplaces. So it's a swings and roundabouts situation when it comes to productivity, I think.
Yeah, I'm just scrolling down the questions here now as well, and so I think this one leads back to the discussion around the interdisciplinary work and what you were mentioning, Chris Warhurst, earlier as well. So again from Mark Howard, given the commentary from both of you, is it time for a radical rethink, do you think, of occupational health, moving to a therapy-led type of service?
I think there is, some merit to that. It's always, tough to. It's always easier to think in terms of evolution rather than revolution. But I do think that occupational health as a discipline needs some fundamental changes. And if I look at different areas, such as the NHS. Currently, people are trying to reimagine what occupational health could look like going forward. So I'm definitely in that camp. But Chris, I don't know what your thinking is.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I think there is some rethinking needs to go on there. And I instead of being downstream, I think it'd be useful to see occupational health upstream in part of the planning process around jobs. And I really would like to see occupational health taught in business schools. I would like to see occupational health taught as a core component of medical education. I'd like to see the outcomes of occupational health taught in engineering schools as well. I mean, it's interesting that we've had this big debate for the last, 5 or 6 years about the clever robots are coming. And now we're suddenly realizing that when the clever robots do come, or if they do come, there will be massive occupational health and safety impacts. And we've not thought that through sufficiently. People working alone with robots, or actually the physical dangers from robots, and having to put robots behind cages and things. So instead of just starting with the technology and what might happen, we ought to be looking at what would be best for humans in that situation. So I think there is a role for occupational health to move upstream into part of the planning process rather than the looking at the outcomes of the implementation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the robots and AI coming along, there's going to be another change to how we do everything. And just Perna Singal, if you're listening in, perhaps you could rephrase your question, please. I don't think we've got the end of it. So maybe if you could just resend that if you're listening in. And also any questions that we don't get to answer now, I'm sure we'll be able to respond later to that outside of this seminar. I think a question here from Charlotte Stegau. Sorry, Charlotte, if I've pronounced your last name incorrectly there. But our organisation is in the middle of planning the future of work, sort of a hybrid working style. So obviously that's on the thoughts of many of us, I think, both in organisations and as employees. How are we going to come back and bounce back whilst taking the best of pre-COVID and post-COVID? And so what do businesses need to keep in mind in terms of health at work when considering this topic?
So I'll give an answer, Chris, and then you jump in as well. So I guess the first thing I would say is a certain amount of humility. There's always uncertainty about what the future holds. So I would try to learn lessons from the experience. I would not set anything in stone, and I would just see how hybrid working emerges within your workplace and try to learn some of those lessons as it unfolds, and also make some adjustments along the way. The second point I think is and Chris started on this journey, is also take human-centric approaches in a sense, and that seems obvious, but I think in terms of humans, we like social interactions. We need a certain amount of sleep. We need a certain number of breaks. We need regular food along the way. Those are all obvious points. But putting the human at the center, whatever approach that you take, is absolutely critical. along the way. And often those human aspects are overlooked. Workplaces often interrupt our biorhythms. They often sometimes do it on purpose. So trying to think through what your employees want in terms of what is good in terms of human behavior and what humans need, I think are always really good starting points. And that's independent of whether it's a pandemic or anything else. And I think my argument today is that if you do that, then you also have more productive employees and it will be good for business. But Chris, I don't know if you have any points.
Some good points there, Chris. We're going through this now with my institutes. I mean, the COVID pandemic made us do things we never thought we could do, or made us do things we never wanted to do, or thought were impossible. And now we're at the other end of this, thinking about can the Institute for Employment Research refashion itself around its employment practices? And we're starting with a model which is inputs, processes, and outcomes. So looking at the inputs, we're thinking about resources. Do people have the IT equipment? Do people have Wi-Fi access? Do people have space at home to be able to work? And that differs. I mean, it's a big difference between a professor having a study at home and one of our admin staff, junior admin staff, having space at home to do that. And then in terms of the kind of process, we're thinking about the occupational health and safety issues. Chris mentioned the musculoskeletal issues. I often Zoom people who are sat on their beds with their laptops. Now, that's not a healthy posture to be working in. And then I think there's liability issues as well related to that. And organizations haven't really thought through those liability issues. They've gone, sucked into the hubris of working from home. And then there's the outcomes, which is not just the kind of productivity and innovation things we've talked about, but also if people are working at home, their visibility. And it may be that workers who are already marginalized or invisible already in the workplace, particular workers, like disabled workers, or migrant workers, may be even more invisible in the workplace as an outcome of that. So you've got to think through, as Chris says, the kind of human-centric processes and outcomes and values in this process.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, both of you, around that. And we've just got literally just 2 minutes left now before we close the seminar. So I think I'd like to thank both of yourselves, Professor Warhurst and Dr. Van Stoke, for a very interesting afternoon's discussion there over this last hour. I think what you said there, Chris, about putting the human at the centre and starting with what people need. I think good takeaways, I think, from the tone of this afternoon. I'd also like to thank everybody for attending this afternoon. And really, that brings us to the close of the session this afternoon. I know Chris, you'll be taking the conversations forwards. I know you're looking at setting up a centre. And so if anybody would like to reach out and I'm sure discuss with yourselves, or reach out via me, I'm sure I can put you in touch as well, then please do that. Otherwise, it's left for me to ask you to complete the audience snapshot survey if possible. You'll see that link coming up now. And otherwise, have a fantastic rest of the day. Make sure you keep your own well-being in place. Look at some of your boundaries, and I wish you all a very productive and pleasant afternoon.
Mike, thank you for chairing. Thank everybody for coming along.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye now.